All right. Hi, everyone. It's the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started because we have two sessions planned for you tonight. You can stay for one or both. It's up to you. But for the first hour, we will be talking about getting started in ABA research in the UAE, talking about developing research questions, getting ethics approval, and more. We'll introduce the two of us in just a moment, but just want to mention that this CEU event is sponsored by Emirates College for Advanced Education, as well as the Association for Behavior Analysis UAE, and the session is eligible for Behavior Analyst Certification Board Continuing Education credits. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So a few administrative items. I think at this point, most of us are familiar with Microsoft Teams, but just a note, do make sure that your microphones and cameras are muted and turned off unless you're asking or answering a question, mostly just so we don't catch you on the recording, because if your cameras are on, you're going to be recorded on the session video. However, feel free to engage in the chat as much as you want, because there are two of us presenting. One of us will always be active in the chat, so feel free to ask questions, make comments, and especially respond to questions that we ask. Next, Behavior Analyst Certification Board CEU certificates. So if you are a board certified behavior analyst, board certified assistant behavior analyst, or a BCBA at the doctoral level, then you are eligible, if you are watching live, to earn one continuing education credit, an ethics one. You need to take note of two code words that we will share with you. So don't write them in the chat or anything. These are just for you. At the end of the session, we will give you a link to a form, and then your certificate will be generated automatically. Finally, the slides, the references, and a recording will be shared with all in attendance. If you want to, you're welcome to scan the QR code and see the references ahead of time. Belen will put that link in the chat. But then, as a follow-up email you will get from Dr. Michelle, the person who coordinates this series, you'll get all of those resources. Also, just a note, if you are signed in on your phone, you may want to join from a laptop or a desktop computer instead. We do have quite a few QR codes that you might want to scan and follow on your phone. If you only have your phone, no worries. We'll put all those links in the chat as well. Also, just want to bring to your attention, in case you don't know already, if you are a BACB certificant, you do have access, free access as part of your certification to peer-reviewed journals. So we're going to be mentioning a lot of research articles that you may want to track down on your own. So if you're a BACB certificant, all you have to do is get to the BACB webpage, click on My Account in the upper right-hand corner, sign in to your portal account, and then once you're in, you go to the Resources tab that's highlighted there in red, and all these journals you have access to: Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in Practice, and so forth. So you have access to all of those. So please feel free to utilize that resource that you have. So this is our plan for our hour together. We'll do some welcome and introductions just so we get to know each other a little bit. We'll be talking a lot today about ethics in research and getting ethics approval. We'll talk about different types of research in the ABA, talk about developing research questions and experimental protocols. We'll talk a little bit about procuring funding and collaborating with universities. And then the part I'm most excited about, Belen and I will be having a discussion about research experiences and successes in the UAE from a university, school, or center partnership perspective. So we'll get started with a welcome and introductions. Very briefly, I am Dr. Sarah Mead Jasperse. I'm assistant professor at Emirates College for Advanced Education in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. I work with my colleague, Dr. Michelle Kelly, who's the one who you've been getting emails from setting up this event. And we both have a focus on applied behavior analysis. That's all I'm going to say about me for now. Let me let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Belen Inaraja Lopez. I am the research specialist at the Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Special Education, operated by the New England Center for Children. And I have been in this position for over 3 years now. And it is my pleasure to be here, and I hope that you all find this information and all these tips very helpful.
Use your words. Say, I want to switch off the light.
Belen, you should be able to go to people and mute microphones. I think you have the ability to do that. So the reason why Belen and I are working together is because we have an ongoing working relationship together to be able to have a productive research relationship to support and see through research projects in a clinical setting. So hopefully if you are someone in a clinical setting, you can kind of look at what Belen is doing as kind of a model. If you're someone in a university setting, you may be able to kind of see from my perspective, and then together what we've built is much larger than either of our organizations could be on their own. So if you're curious kind of what types of human behavior research do we look at, Belen and I have kind of a broad portfolio, our hands in a lot of pies. So we're interested in skill acquisition projects, we're interested in behavior reduction, staff training, looking at stimulus control. There's a lot of technology involved in these. This is just a sample to kind of give you the perspective that we're coming from here. But what I'd like to do now is figure out who are you? Who's with us today to make sure that we're hitting the mark in terms of the information that you want us to be sharing. So if you wouldn't mind, I would love to hear in the chat what your role is in the delivery of ABA services. So as an example, you may be a student or a client in an ABA program, a parent, you may be a behavior technician, a graduate student, a behavior analyst, special education teacher, maybe an allied health professional, I'm sure there are other people in our audience. Just go ahead and tell us in the chat. Perfect. Asha gave us a great example. So lead BCBA, BCBA-D, wonderful. Welcome, Dr. Teresa. Sharifa, of course, you'll be hearing from Sharifa in the second half. So keep those coming. It'll let us know we have a lot of BCBAs. Ooh, in the BCBA in the Cayman Islands. Yeah, tell us where you're working too. BCABA, BCABA, RBT. Wonderful. So hopefully you will be able to see yourself in a research context once we're finished with our presentation here today. Doctoral student, beautiful. All right, I have 3 questions for you. So question number 2. How would you describe your experience with clinical research? Now, you're welcome to come up with your own rating scale, but you may want to put it kind of a Likert scale from a novice, I've never conducted research before, I don't even really know much about research, beginner, intermediate, expert, it's a huge part of your job responsibility. How would you rank your experience with clinical research at this point? Beginner in the audience. Awesome. Thank you, Ashman. Ahmed's never conducted entry level. Yeah, Ashman, I bet you'll have a lot to say when we get talking about ethics approval. Beginner, intermediate, got some experts. I thought that we might hear from Dr. Teresa. Wonderful. All right. So at whatever level you would kind of put yourself at, feel free to engage at that level in the chat. So if you do, you do have the expertise here, feel free to add to what we're saying, give more suggestions. If this is very new to you and we say something that you don't understand, feel free to ask in the chat throughout. Lots of beginners, which I'm excited to see that people who would consider themselves novice or beginner have showed up to a presentation about research. Last question. You may not have thought about this yet if you're in the novice or beginner category, but how would you describe your interest in research? So here are some examples. Are you interested in skill acquisition? How people build new skills or generalize skills or maintain skills? Are you interested in behavior reduction? So if there are problematic or disruptive behaviors going on, how do we reduce those behaviors and kind of shift them to more appropriate or alternative responses? Are you interested in staff training, parent training? Perfect. Thank you, Jocelyn, there. Other categories that people are interested in. We'll try to use some of these examples throughout our presentation today. behavior reduction, skill acquisition. Yeah, a lot of clinical research ends up being one of those two. We're either trying to increase a behavior or decrease behavior. Sharifa in there with staff well-being. I love it. Ties into your topic tonight for Journal Club. Sleep treatment training. Awesome. Joanna's there. Parent training, staff training. Wonderful. So we have a lot of people who have similar interests, but then some very unique areas of interest here. So I also want to just kind of pause for a moment and think about the role of the scientist practitioner in applied behavior analysis and in clinical research. Now, many of you have said that you're a BCBA or a BCABA, so it means that you went through an academic program either at the bachelor's level or a master's level. Did your programs cover what it means to be a scientist practitioner? How would you describe that role as a scientist practitioner? That sometimes people outside our field or who are not familiar with clinical research and think about science and research and think about it happening only in laboratories or in very controlled conditions. Any thoughts on what it means to be a scientist practitioner? It's okay if this terminology is new to you as well. Yeah, that's where I would start too. That at the core of what it means to be an applied behavior analyst, whatever our job duties are on a daily basis, the core of that is inherently analytic and scientific at what we're doing. Like you're saying, back to Baer, Wolf, and Risley. So in whatever way we're interested in teaching a new behavior, increasing a behavior, decreasing a behavior, the methods that we've been taught to do that are science. And the way that we apply them is in a practitioner role. So I can tell that this was a good response that just came in. A person that applies the science in an applied setting, but bases all decisions in best practice literature, looks at data to make decisions. That's beautiful. Joanna, I might steal that definition for a future presentation. So this is the perspective that we'll be coming at for the rest of the hour. So science is not something separate from being a clinician in ABA. Research is even not something that much separate from being a clinician in ABA. You actually already have a lot of the skill sets and tools to be able to conduct clinical research. So if this is new terminology to you, a great place that I recommend going to start is a special issue of the journal Education and Treatment of Children that came out in 2018. And there's a series of articles about the concept of the scientist practitioner, its extension and behavior analysis. So this is one article from that special issue. Here's another one where the researchers surveyed the current state of the scientist practitioner model. So if this is something that has intrigued you or you've never considered yourself a scientist practitioner, this is a great journal issue to go look at to kind of dig a little bit deeper. Thank you for putting that link in the chat, or both links. So you are getting an ethics CEU here. So we want to spend a little bit of time talking about ethics in research and getting ethics approval and what it means to ethically conduct clinical ABA research. If you missed it, I know that there are many familiar names and faces in the crowd. If you're interested in kind of more broadly looking at ethics in ABA, I will just direct your attention. Dr. Michelle and I co-presented on a CEU event a couple of weeks ago titled the why behind the what ethics in ABA. So you're welcome to, if you're curious, you can watch the recorded version of that webinar. Do note that CEUs are not available for recorded webinars, but if we pique your interest, you may want to go back to that. And also, I'm going to be kind of starting us off talking about the history a little bit. So again, if you were there, you might hear a little bit of the same content, but if it piques your interest, head back to that CEU event. So So if you were at that one, you heard me talk about Willowbrook State School. So when we talk about the reason why we need to have such strict ethics requirements in research, it is to prevent reoccurrences of situations like what happened at Willowbrook State School. So there are a variety of horrific events that went on at Willowbrook State School. There's a documentary by Geraldo Rivera that's what that QR code sends you to. Do just a warning, it's a very graphic documentary. But one of the unethical things that was happening was a research program there in which the researchers were purposefully infecting students with hepatitis to study the course of the disease and to study ways to prevent it and treat it. And in that, obviously, a lot of people then became infected with hepatitis. So this really is hopefully an example of very unethical research that would not be approved in today's state of things. So if what we're talking about seems like it's too strict or over the top, it really is because the history has resulted in all of these requirements for ethics. So hopefully we've emphasized kind of the grounding there. Now, as behavior analysts, kind of what governs your behavior with respect to ethical research behavior? Hopefully you are familiar with the ethics code for behavior analysts, the newest version that went into effect on January 1st, 2022. So this code applies to all BCBA-Ds, BCBAs, BCABAs, and applicants. So if you're in graduate school, you're taking your coursework, getting your field work, this applies to you as well. And it covers all of our professional activities, including research. So if you look at the code now, it has 6 sections. So what we're really going to be zooming into today is section 6, responsibilities in research. So I told you section 6 is responsibility in research, right? So there are 11 items under responsibility of research. Now, some of them are very straightforward, like plagiarism. Hopefully that's an obvious one. We don't take other people's work and say that it is our own. We cite appropriately when we're using someone else's wording or data. So we're not going to go into some of those plagiarism, data fabrication, those things. But we've picked, I believe, 5. They're the ones with the stars that we're going to go into a little bit more. So conforming with laws and regulations in research, that should be an obvious one, hopefully not too much to discuss. But there is a lot to talk about in terms of research review. There, especially for tonight's topic, talking about research and service delivery. That's what you hear a lot from Belen about at the end. Informed consent in research and confidentiality. We have requirements in clinical work, but we have unique requirements in research with respect to those items. And we'll talk about competence in conducting research. And then you can see the rest of the items: conflicts of interest, giving credit, plagiarism, documentation, data retention, accuracy. Most of those hopefully are straightforward. So let's dive into some of the more nuanced items of section 6. So 6.02, research review, tells us that behavior analysts conduct research, whether independent or in the context of service delivery, only after approval by a formal research review committee. That's all our code says. What does this really mean? You're going to hear, I think you'll be excited. You'll hear a lot from Belen about what this looks like in clinical practice at her center. But a few notes from me ahead of time. These committees exist to protect actually a variety of stakeholders. So they exist to protect the participants. I think that one's obvious. But it also protects me as a researcher. Make sure someone else has signed off on what I'm doing. It protects the institution and how that research reflects on them and their liability. And it protects the public from unethical research activities. So the members of this research approval committee or research review committee, these should be people who are independent of the research team. If I'm proposing research, I should not also be the one to approve it. And this committee should include subject matter experts as well as community members and laypersons. So maybe potential participants, someone who would be eligible to participate would be a great person to have on the committee. they can't then participate in it, but someone who represents that demographic. At a university, this is usually an institutional review board. So as a researcher, prior to recruiting any participants, collecting any data, I can't go out and tell people about my project and get them to line up to participate. I need to submit my research proposal to the committee and have it approved and documented in writing. That's really the first big hurdle to conducting research in a clinical setting. And then I need to make sure that my approval committee receives regular status updates as well as immediate reporting of any adverse effects that occur. Now, when I first wrote my first proposal, I didn't know much about what the committee was looking for. Like, are they looking for certain procedures? Are they going to, critique how I describe visual analysis? The next slide here, this is kind of, this is not from any specific publication. This is my own experience of different committees that I have run my research through, what they've been interested in. Almost all of them have been interested in the relevance of the research questions to participants. Does it matter to the population that you're actually trying to conduct the research with? Everyone's going to be interested in privacy and security of data. Most are interested in time and commitment required by the participants. This is something that sometimes we skip over. If we say there's going to be 20 sessions, how long are those sessions? How many are you conducting per day? Certainly informed consent and assent processes are critical to your research review. Equity of selection of participants. How are we going to make sure everyone has a fair shot of participating in this? Committees definitely also look at the benefit versus burden ratio to the participants and how you're going to account for, document, and report any adverse events. Then finally, the big two that are really, from my experience, the make or break. What are the risks to the participants, the researchers, and the institutions? And do they go above the risks in everyday life? If they do, as a researcher, I need to justify how that meets the rest of these things, how that fits into the ratio, how it's relevant to the participants. They're very into risk and clear links between my research questions, my data collection process, and my data analysis. They want to make sure that people's time are not being wasted for bad science, for lack of a better term. So they're kind of the double check to make sure that I've put together a proposal that's actually going to be able to answer my research questions in an appropriate manner. So if you are currently working in a clinical role and you are not connected with a university, so you don't have connection to an institutional review board, Dr. David Cox just published this article in 2020 about setting up ethics committees in behavioral health settings. So this is a good article to go to if you're kind of at the start and you want to see what it would take to set up a review committee like this in clinical practice. If you have questions, again, Belen's active in the chat, so feel free to talk with her in there. Next up is research and service delivery. I don't want to take too much time here because this is a lot of what Belen will be talking about at the end. But if we're doing clinical research, it's important that we're promoting and protecting the client services and client welfare. So this means our research questions should be relevant to the clinical needs of the client, and the research activity should not interfere with clinical progress. So you may want to consider the following safeguards when you're conducting clinical research, potentially requiring ethics approval on a client-by-client basis. So not just approving the project, but actually saying, I'm going to approve that this project is conducted with Sean as the participant. You may also want to consider third-party oversight or peer review if the clinician on record is also the researcher for that project. So again, to be continued with Belen at the end. There also is a great article that is in early view on behavior analysis in practice right now. Dr. Matt Norman and Haley Donohue just published Research Ethics for Behavior Analysts in Practice. So if this is you, you're working in a clinical role and you want to think deeply about ethical research in clinical practice, this is I would say an easy to read, straightforward article that's kind of a guide to the questions that you should be asking. Some other resources to look at for clinical research: Declaration of Helsinki, which was first written in 1964. This really kind of opened the door on clinical research. It's written about medical clinical research, but a lot of it applies to behavioral work as well. And then you may want to look at the Belmont report. So the whole first section of the Belmont report is really talking about medical and behavioral research in a clinical setting. I think if you were at our last talk, we talked about how Dr. Joseph Brady, he was the associate chairperson of the committee that wrote this report, was a behavior analyst. So these foundational guidelines on clinical research were written with a behavior analyst at the table. So I know I'm going quickly through these slides, but they're more just references for you if you're interested in getting started in clinical research. Next up is informed consent and confidentiality in research. So we said before, these are terms that hopefully if you're in clinical work, you're used to. Getting consent for certain interventions, maintaining client confidentiality. But when we talk about it in research, there's a few pieces to think about more deeply. So some questions to consider here. Are the informed consent processes for clinical service and research activities clearly separated? So someone can consent and say, I want to go get ABA clinical services, but I don't want to participate in that research project, and that's okay. And that separation is made very clear to parents, guardians, and participants themselves. Again, Belen will come back to this of what this looks like at their center. And who will need to have access to the data collected as part of the research activity? So we were just saying, pick research questions that are applicable to their clinical needs. So if there's a researcher coming in, who then needs to have access to the results? So you're doing a functional analysis study. What the results of that study hopefully will help to inform clinical practice. How can the clinicians who are ultimately responsible for programming ethically get access to those research data? So these are some things to think about ahead of time. And to make sure you have the appropriate safeguards in place, I definitely recommend planning all of those data collection, storage, sharing, dissemination procedures in advance and include them in your ethics review process. So make sure that that review committee sees all of the decisions that you've made about consent and confidentiality. I also recommend that the research files are kept separate from clinical files. Ensure that the research data are as de-identified as possible. So you probably all in your own clinical setting have clinical files, assessment files, treatment plan files, right? Those likely have identifying information in some way, which is fine because they're being kept internally, hopefully. So the only people who have access to those are people who are on that client's team, are part of that client's programming responsibilities. Once you take those data out of the clinical context and say you're getting ready to present a poster at a research conference or you're getting ready to submit a manuscript for publication, it is critical that we haven't taken the identifying information out of the clinical setting and let it get into our research. So what Belen and I do, we use participant numbers, we store our consent forms separate from our data streams, we store any identifiable materials such as videos, because the person's image is on that, only on encrypted hardware in a locked location. So if we're taking videos as part of our research, we're not putting those on shared drives or through email. Those are literally only going on an external hard drive. If you kind of want to go back to make sure that you have the right definitions, our new ethics code for behavior analysts has in the glossary definition of informed consent, what needs to be part of that, specifically for research. And then also one of the recent revisions included a definition of assent. Another document to go back to is the protection of human subjects. This is often called the common rule. So this over any sort of federally funded or overseen research in the U.S. has to abide by this part of the Federal Code of Regulations. So this also, you may not have to follow it, but it has good guidance for how to develop informed consent processes and assent processes. And finally, competence in conducting research. So we talk about competence in clinical work, right? So the expectations for competence in research, they're similar for expectations for competence in other areas of clinical ABA. So you want to ask yourselves before you get started on any research, do I have mastery level competence in this research environment, in this context, working with these research participants, working with these types of target behaviors, interventions, methods, and data analysis, and at that scale of project. So if you've conducted, maybe a capstone project in a bachelor's program, that would be a very different scale than conducting a multi-site research project with many, many participants. So a good resource here that I'm guessing many of you might already be familiar with is an article that was published in 2018 by Matthew Broadhead and colleagues about the scope of competence for behavior analysts. And there's a nice table there that is kind of a checklist. So this was designed for clinical work, but you could modify it pretty easily to think about your competence related to research. That's kind of our big ethics overview. We'll circle back to ethics in about 15 minutes when we get to the discussion of research experiences and successes in the UAE. Let's move on to talking about research. This is where I want to hear from some of you. So first, I want to differentiate between basic research and applied research. Make sure these terms we're all familiar with. So basic research, this is concerned with the advancement of knowledge, and it may or may not have immediate and specific applications to practical concerns. So we might be studying like the relation between reinforcer size and post-reinforcement pause in mice, for example. That's in contrast to applied research. So here we have a systematic investigation that's related to the pursuit of knowledge in practical realms or to solve real-world problems. So an example here might be studying the relation between reinforcer magnitude and duration of in-seat behavior in the classroom. So usually in ABA research, we're talking about applied research, something that has real-world impact. I want to talk a little bit about the feedback loop in ABA. So certainly basic research, what's done in the laboratory with animals, this informs our applied research, which informs our clinical practice. I don't remember who it was. I think it was maybe Joanna that was saying, part of being a scientist practitioner is being able to go to the literature, read the research, and then apply it. Absolutely, that's going in one direction. But the other clinical piece is looping backwards the other way. So we need clinical practice, so all of you who said you were in clinical settings, to help us identify research questions. What's not working correctly, or what do you think could be more efficient or better or lead to better maintenance? All these things that you think about as clinicians, to kind of toss those back to be evaluated in basic and applied research. So if you've ever thought about that, how could this be improved? How could I do this better? Then you're ready to develop research questions. Now we're going to get into a little bit of terminology. Don't worry, this is not class, but we do need to be using the same language. So when we're developing research questions, we're going to talk about dependent variables. So this is the measured behavior in the experiment. And we want to determine if it changes as a result of the manipulations of the independent variables. So in ABA, this is some measure of a socially significant behavior. This is your target behavior. So tell us in the chat, what are some dependent variables that interest you? What would you like to study? Some of you said behavior acquisition, behavior reduction. So what exact behaviors are you interested in changing? People who said staff training, what behavior are you looking to change in staff? Increasing attention. Perfect. Thanks for getting us started, Doopy. We'll wait for some others to come in. Dr. Michelle wants to change the number of comments in the chat at ACE events. Hopefully you want to increase those, Dr. Michelle. Parent engagement, for sure. Awesome one, Jocelyn. Engage duration, frequency of engaging with their children. So keep those coming in. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next one, but think about what are some DVs that interest you? What behaviors do you like working with in a clinical setting? Yeah, Belen, what behaviors do you want to study? Often target behaviors might be something like, greetings. We want to increase greetings. We want to increase self-feeding, or we want to decrease aggression, things like that. So then to write our research questions, we need to think about independent variables. So this is what we systematically manipulate to see whether it results in a change in the DV. So in ABA, this is an environmental event, something that happens before or after the DV. So even if you didn't tell us in the chat, what IVs might affect your DV? Dr. Shannon, functional communication responses, social validity, problem behavior. Dr. Shannon's addressing it all. She's studying all the behaviors. I love it. Thanks for all those examples, Shannon. So you've thought about your behavior. Now, again, this is what you do as a clinician. What might change that behavior? What do I need to do to increase it or decrease it? Potentially, Dr. Shannon's response there, the smiley face, might affect Dr. Michelle's target behavior. So we might try to increase comments in the chat by offering reactions, thumbs up, smiley faces. Aisha's interested in requesting as a DV. Attention, maintain dangerous behaviors. Yes, perfect. So we're getting some more DVs. We're getting some IVs. So yeah, Michelle's saying the instructor could ask more questions. Put it right back on me. If I want more comments in the chat, I need to change my own behavior. Getting the work on time, submitting work on time, beautiful. And you might use BST video modeling. You're getting this. And again, you do this as clinicians, right? So to write a research question, really all you have to do is fill in the frames. What are the effects of the IV on the DV? Boom, you have a research question. So feel free to put that in the chat. So I'm going to combine Jocelyn's IV and one of Shannon's. Let's see. Yeah, functional communication responses. So what are the effects of behavioral skills training on functional communication responses? Once you fill in that frame, you've written your research question. And there are lots of different effects we might be interested in. That's definitely very simple, like what are the effects, but we might be interested in how much it changes, what direction does the DV change, how quickly does it change, how long do the changes last, in what environments do they occur, are there different effects depending on some parameters, so you can get more advanced, right? But it all comes back down to that very first sentence frame, and then we can build off of that. Now, how do you measure your effects? To some degree, this depends on what your IV and DV are. You may use different procedures. I'm going to zoom kind of out, big picture for a moment to talk about research designs. So if research is kind of brand new to you and you're just kind of walking into it, you may want to take a step back and look at the big picture. So this QR code goes to a video that's an introduction to different types of research. It goes in big categories, qualitative and quantitative. Under quantitative has experimental, non-experimental. Most applied clinical ABA research is probably going to fall under the single case or single subject research designs. So again, if you want to go deeper, feel free to check out this video and kind of see the big picture and then see where we reside under the umbrella of different types of research. So if you're a BCBA, hopefully these terms are familiar, but you'll probably use some type of single subject research design, maybe an AB demonstration, more likely probably a reversal, multiple baseline design, multi-element design, changing criterion design. If you've forgotten these over the years, a good place to go back to is the most recent version of the Cooper Heron Heward textbook, and part 3 is all about this. So 5 chapters there about all the different ways that you could test your research question. But at the end of the day, regardless of what experimental design you use, you're looking for control of the DV by the IV. So if our behavior has not been turned off and turned on with the introduction and removal of some type of intervention, our IV, then we don't have control over the behavior. Again, very similar to clinical work, right? This is not that different. This is what you should be doing in clinical practice all the time. Just making sure that you have all the ethical research components in place to be able to then disseminate your work and publish it, etc. that was a pretty quick primer about the ethics of clinical research, talking about really how to think about research questions, not that different than your clinical questions. We'll spend about 5 minutes talking about funding and collaborating with universities, and we'll wrap up with our discussion with Belen about her experience. A little note about funding before I talk to you about how to procure funding. So this is a study that my colleagues and I published in September 2022. I'm just going to poll the audience. How much funding do you think I received for this project? It was a study that was published as a brief report in Behavioral Interventions Journal. Anyone guess how much money I got to complete this study? I'm interested to see your guesses. How much funding do you think I received for this project? Yes. Yes. We've got some people in the crowd who guessed it. I was wondering if people thought that I was going to have that. Yes, nothing. Exactly. So this was a study that was conducted as part of clinical work. Our client is sitting over there on the right. He's the cool dude in the sunglasses. But we needed to assess this challenging behavior that was occurring, and we wanted to go about it in kind of a unique way that hadn't been used before. So we made sure to get consent to do research and to collect data and to disseminate, and we ran it through an institutional review board. But what we were doing was just part of clinical research. We did not get any funding above and beyond that. So I wish I got that much money, me, Joe. How about this? So this is one of my graduate students at Aurora University. I think you probably already know. Any guesses on how much funding Heather received for her thesis? Once again, zero. So these are Heather and her colleagues. They worked for a nonprofit in the US that worked on a very, very small budget. So Heather and her colleagues, they didn't have any fancy two-way mirrors or cameras looking into rooms. This is the two of them. Don't do this. This looks very unsafe. They're standing on boxes of paper in a ceiling looking down to collect data for the session. So it is very possible to do high quality research without funding, as long as you have, creativity, good clinical work. That'll take you a long way. I don't know if anyone can figure out what this was a study about, but this was another clinical research project. It was an assessment project. I don't really have time to wait for your guesses, but this was the study of elopement. So we're just at the clinic. We built like our own barriers to make sure that we had a safe environment to assess elopement in. So you can do research on a clinical budget. Now, Sharifa was saying, what do you use that money for if you get funding? Lots of cool stuff. So you can go above and beyond, especially if you're working in collaborations, to be able to publish articles as open access articles, being able to use kind of top of the line so they don't have to stand in the ceiling. They could buy some video cameras. So there are definitely good reasons why you might want to look for funding. So if you do consider looking for funding, you might want to look at organizations related to maybe the population of participants. So if you happen to be doing research with individuals with autism or autistic individuals, Organization for Autism Research, Autism Speaks, both of those are organizations that provide funding for research about autism. Location in which the research will be conducted. So I have a very generous grant from Aspire right now. That's an Abu Dhabi-based funding agency that looks to fund research happening in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. So look around you in your own location. And then finally, look at your own experience and traits. So there are also funding and grants for certain backgrounds, certain types of experience, level of education. So oftentimes this funding will emphasize demographics that have been historically underrepresented in research. So also think about yourself when you're looking for funding. So just a few benefits of partnering with universities, which is going to segue us into talking about the partnership that we have. So if you're interested in this, but you don't really know where to start with research, partnering with a university can be a good option. When you have that partnership set up, you can get mentored research experience, people who do this as their full-time job. There's potential for paid positions as research assistants on projects. You generally, if you're partnered, you can use their institutional review board, so you wouldn't have to set up your own research ethics committee. And it helps you prepare if you think that you might be interested in further graduate school, further training, an opportunity to kind of stay connected with academia while you're working in the clinical world. Now, how do you initiate those partnerships? Number one is to read recent publications and look at the affiliations. Who's publishing the type of research that you're interested in? What university are they at? And what faculty members are they? You can join research journal clubs. So I recommend you stick around for our ABA journal club tonight with Ms. Sharifa. You can look for job postings for research assistants at local universities or online programs. So you find a university that looks like they have an interesting program, go to their website and see if they have any job postings for research assistants. You can also contact the research office at universities to inquire about opportunities in your field of interest. Maybe their job posting isn't on a website, but the research office actually keeps a listing of the openings. And finally, attending conferences and networking. Know that many of you who are board certified behavior analysts or who are practicing clinicians go to conferences to get CEUs. Take the opportunity to go talk to some people who are conducting the type of research you're interested and see if you can get something kind of organically going. So now this is the part that I've been looking forward to. I hope you've been looking forward to. It's going to be kind of a one-person panel discussion. We want to hear from Belen how Mohammed bin Rashid Center has developed the really impressive clinical research program that they have in ABA. So I'm going to be asking Belen some questions. She'll answer. Feel free to also ask her questions in the chat. So Belen, you ready?
I am ready.
So first, just tell us what your research portfolio looks like at MRC-NECC.
Hello, everyone. So at MRC-NECC, we conduct kind of both research internally, but also we do a lot of research in collaboration with external entities. So at MRC-NECC, you can find research that we are doing within our own research labs. We currently have 2 labs. One of them is focused on like assessment and treatment of problem behavior, and the other one more focused towards skill acquisition. We also, on the other hand, we have graduate students that might also need to conduct research in collaboration with their universities to fulfill their degrees requirements. So some of the universities we collaborate often. Some examples are Ulster University in Northern Ireland. We also have some graduate students from Arizona State University, Drexel University, Capella University, Simmons, and other local universities like UAE. We also, it's not only our students or us in the research department, but like we also help our other departments, our MRC-NECC, conducting research, either internally or also externally. For example, our SLP department is involved currently in 2 projects with Kuwait University and another project with UAE. And also our FCRD department, our Family Community Relationships department, it is involved in a research project with a Special Olympics and Pretoria University. And outside of our graduate programs, we also conduct external research collaboration. This is where Dr. Sarah Mead kind of comes in. So of course, we do a lot of research with ECAE. We have a long history of collaborations. And it might come as like we get in contact with like some individuals or universities that are looking to conduct research with our population. For example, right now we have a past Emirati MRC-NECC intern that is completing her master's in the US, and we're helping her run a survey here with our parents. We've also done in the past collaborations with Higher College of Technology. So kind of coming from all fronts.
I don't know how you keep track of all of the components of your research portfolio, but it's always impressive every time I hear the amount of research and the breadth of research that's occurring at MRC-NECC. So you have hundreds of employees, teachers, all kinds of different roles. If a staff member at MRC-NECC is interested in conducting research, how do they get started? What's that process?
So outside of like what a graduate program is, we always encourage our staff to get involved in research by joining a research lab. As we mentioned before, we have those 2 active research labs, and we meet weekly. So it's like a great place to get started and get to see what is going on in the center. And kind of relating it back to the ethics and our code of ethics, section 606 was reminding us that we should only conduct research independently after having done so under supervision, like that area of competence, right? So as the same that we would do with our professional practice, we do need to make sure that we have the appropriate training and experience in a certain domain and a certain topic to go ahead and do research there. So research labs does exactly what they provide, right? Like we provide supervision, we provide training, support, and a community for those who are new to research to start gaining that competence in a certain topic, surrounded by people that are already experts or are on the way to be experts in that domain, and also gaining experience in all those systems that are involved in conducting research itself, which there are a lot.
Yeah, so lots of ways to be involved. It doesn't have to be, I like hearing that it doesn't have to be just only graduate students who are involved in research. A thesis is not a one and done when you work at MRC-NECC. So next question for you, we have, let's see how many minutes we have left. We have about 8 minutes left, which is kind of perfect timing for us. So we talked about all these great research collaborations that you have. Can you talk a little bit about what you require to start a research collaboration? So if a university comes to you, what would be required? And if you're interested in beginning a collaboration with a university, what do you do?
So we have a list of things that we do require, and kind of in line with what we talked before during this event, we do always require the proof of that IRB approval. So an IRB has to approve that project, so we need that in writing. We will also require a copy of the studies methods, and also copies of those informed consents and assent forms. We always want to have a look at those as well. We also will ask for any additional paperwork that might be relevant to your study. So for example, if your study is a survey to parents, we would also ask you to send us a copy of those questions. If there's a questionnaire involved, same. And also we will ask the investigators to provide the copies of the translated documents if that is appropriate for the study.
Sorry, I was so excited in the chat that I had myself muted.
Yes.
I was going to say, Dr. Michelle, if you're there and you have the link, please feel free to go for it and throw it in the chat. I can't copy paste right now. So if people are interested in this article, it's just published by some collaboration between Emirates College for Advanced Education and MRC-NECC. So next question for you, Belen. We've talked a lot about how do you get started in research, all your ongoing stuff. We have about 5 minutes left. What safeguards do you have in place at MRC-NECC regarding research? This is I love working with your organization because of the thought you've put into ethics.
Yeah, so we've been kind of following our ethics code and some of those articles that you were mentioning before. And so, for example, in alignment with that Directive 601, which was conforming to laws and regulations in research, at MRC-NECC, we have designed our own research policies based not only on our ethics code, but also the DOH guidelines that are kind of our local law and regulation, right? Also, as you mentioned before, Dr. Sarah, 603 in our code of ethics says that the client's welfare is the main priority. And we at MRC-NECC make sure, or try to make sure as much as we can that our research activities match that objective. We look carefully that the research projects that students get involved are beneficial for them, and that their time is well spent in those activities. And we work very closely with clinical teams, designing what we call some internal paperwork, but is what we call the risk assessment forms. So prior to start any of the sessions. In those documents, in collaboration with the clinical teams, we clearly state what are the criteria to start and terminate sessions. So for example, an example of a starting criteria could be 30 minutes free of problem behavior. And an example of termination criteria could be 2 instances of whatever topography of severe problem behavior, and we terminate the session. So we always encouraging teams to include any descriptive scenarios, as well representative of a student providing or refusing assent to participate in session. We also want to make sure that we take into account assent whenever appropriate and as much as appropriate. So for example, could be, we will terminate session if a student attempts to leave the research environment twice within 5 minutes, something like that. So this really provides us with a clear plan on when to start, when to terminate, what to do after, and that is fundamental to ensure the welfare of everyone involved and minimize risks by just being aware of exactly how to act and have a clear plan, which that also aligns with other sections of our ethics code, like 2.15, where the ethics code reminds us to design interventions always thinking of minimizing risk that can cause harm. So we always try to keep an eye for that. And my last point is another topic that always comes up when discussing research is confidentiality. Maintaining confidentiality in research is a very important mission that every researcher should take very carefully and prioritize, as is also stressed in our ethics code. So the way we do that in MRC-NECC is we really adhere to that section of 6.10 in our code of ethics that emphasizes that all records should be stored and should be retained according to standards. So the way we do that is we always provide initial training to all researchers in confidentiality guidelines, and we also make sure that those guidelines are enforced and they are followed. So for example, we do annual and every semester we do policy refreshers. We also do biannual audits of all research folders where I go and I make sure there is no identifiable information stored, only people involved in that particular project has access, and kind of taking every step in our hands to ensure confidentiality and acceptable, appropriate record keeping.
Awesome. I told you all that they had great systems, right? This is again the bar is set high by MRC-NECC in terms of the systems and the safeguard and the oversight and the collaboration. Now, Belen and I weren't sure kind of how chatty we would get, so we had one more question plan that we'll skip over because we want to make sure that we give Ms. Sharifa plenty of time for ABA Journal Club. But I'm sure Belen would be happy to chat with you in the chat or by email about recruitment strategies and increasing buy-in ethically. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much all for your time, your participation. This is what's gonna happen now. We're gonna give you 2 links in the chat. One of them is gonna be an evaluation survey. We'd love to hear what you thought of the hour-long presentation about research in ABA. The second one is very important for anyone who wants continuing education credit for the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. You will need to fill out the form. So either Belen or Dr. Michelle will be putting those links in the chat right now. I think Belen's on it. But meanwhile, I will need to turn it over to Ms. Sharifa Yatim because we have a back-to-back 2-for-1 tonight, ABA Journal Club. So Sharifa is on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen to make sure we give her the full hour, but keep your eye on the chat for the links to the evaluation, as well as the link to the CEU form for the first session. And Belen and I will also put our emails in there for you. Thank you all so much. Sharifa,